The great priest of Shiga temple was a man of the most eminent virtue. His eyebrows were white, and it was as much as he could do to move his old bones along as he hobbled on his stick from one part of the temple to another. In the eyes of this learned ascetic, the world was a mere pile of rubbish. He had lived away from it for many a long year, and the little pine sapling that he had planted with his own hands on moving into his present cell had grown into a great tree whose branches swelled in the wind. A monk who had succeeded in abandoning the floating world for so long a time must feel secure about his future. When the great priest saw the rich and the noble, he smiled with compassion and wondered how it was that these people did not recognize their pleasures for the empty dreams that they were. When he noticed beautiful women, his only reaction was to be moved with pity for men who still inhabited the world of delusion and who were tossed about on the waves of carnal pleasure. In his dreams he lived nightly in the Pure Land, and when he awoke, he knew that to subsist in the present world was to be tied to a sad and evanescent dream. In the flower viewing season, large numbers of people came from the capital to visit the village of Shiga. This did not trouble the priest in the slightest, for he had long since transcended that state in which the clamours of the world can irritate the mind. One spring evening he left his cell, leaning on his stick, and walked down to the lake. It was the hour when dusky shadows slowly begin to thrust their way into the bright light of the afternoon. There was not the slightest ripple to disturb the surface of the water. The priest stood by himself at the edge of the lake and began to perform the holy rite of water contemplation. At that moment, an ox-drawn carriage, clearly belonging to a person of high rank, came round the lake and stopped close to where the priest was standing. The owner was a court lady from the Kyogoku district of the capital, who held the exalted title of Great Imperial Concubine. This lady had come to view the springtime scenery in Shiga, and now, on her return, she had stopped the carriage and raised the blind in order to have a final look at the lake. Unwittingly, the great priest glanced in her direction, and at once he was overwhelmed by her beauty. His eyes met hers, and as he did nothing to avert his gaze, she did not take it upon herself to turn away. It was not that her liberality of spirit was such as to allow men to gaze on her with brazen looks, but the motives of this austere old ascetic could hardly, she felt, be those of ordinary men. After a few moments, the lady pulled down the blind. Her carriage started to move, and having gone through the Shiga Pass, rolled slowly down the road that led to the capital. Night fell, and the carriage made its way towards the city along the road of the Silver Temple. Until the carriage had become a pinprick that disappeared between the distant trees, the great priest stood, rooted to the spot. In the twinkling of an eye, the present world had wreaked its revenge on the priest with terrible force. What he had imagined to be completely safe had collapsed in ruins. He returned to the temple, faced the main image of Buddha, and invoked the sacred name. But impure thoughts now cast their opaque shadows about him. A woman's beauty, he told himself, was but a fleeting apparition, a temporary phenomenon composed of flesh that was soon to be destroyed. Yet try as he might to ward it off, the ineffable beauty which had overpowered him at that instant by the lake now pressed on his heart with the force of something that has come from an infinite distance. The great priest was not young enough, either spiritually or physically, to believe that this new feeling was simply a trick that his flesh had played on him. A man's flesh, he knew full well, could not alter so rapidly. Rather, he seemed to have been immersed in some swift, subtle poison which had abruptly transmuted his spirit. The great priest had never broken his vow of chastity. The inner fight that he had waged in his youth against the demands of the flesh had made him think of women as mere carnal beings. The only real flesh was the flesh that existed in his imagination. Since, therefore, he regarded the flesh as an ideal abstraction rather than as a physical fact, he had relied on his spiritual strength to subjugate it. In this effort, the priest had achieved success. Success, indeed, that no one who knew him could possibly doubt. Yet the face of the woman who had raised the carriage blind and gazed across the lake was too harmonious, too refulgent to be designated as a mere object of flesh, and the priest did not know what name to give it. He could only think that in order to bring about that wondrous moment, something which had for a long time lurked deceptively within him had finally revealed itself. That thing was nothing other than the present world, which until then had been at repose, but which had now suddenly lifted itself out of the darkness and begun to stir. The great imperial concubine of Kyogoku had soon forgotten about the old priest whom she had noticed gazing so intently at her by the lake at Shiga. After some time, however, a rumor came to her ears, and she was reminded of the incident. One of the villagers happened to have caught sight of the great priest as he had stood watching the lady's carriage disappear into the distance. He had mentioned the matter to a court gentleman who had come to Shiga for flower viewing, and had added that since that day the priest had behaved like one crazed. The imperial concubine pretended to disbelieve the rumor. The virtue of this particular priest, however, was noted throughout the capital, and the incident was bound to feed the lady's vanity. For she was utterly weary of the love that she received from the men of this world. She was fully aware of her own beauty, and she tended to be attracted by any force, such as religion, that treated her beauty and her rank as things of no value. Being exceedingly bored with the present world, she believed in the Pure Land. It was inevitable that Jodo Buddhism, which rejected all the beauty and brilliance of the visual world as being mere filth and defilement, should have a particular appeal for someone like the imperial concubine, who was thoroughly disillusioned with the superficial elegance of court life, an elegance that seemed unmistakably to bespeak the latter days of the law and their degeneracy. But the rumors of the great priest's infatuation spread throughout the court. In the end, the story was even told half-jokingly to the emperor himself. The great concubine took no pleasure in this bantering gossip and preserved a cool, indifferent mien. As she was well aware, there were two reasons why the people of the court could joke freely about a matter which would normally have been forbidden. First, by referring to the great priest's love, they were paying a compliment to the beauty of the woman who could inspire even an ecclesiastic of such great virtue to forsake his meditations, and secondly, everyone fully realized that the old man's love for the noblewoman could never possibly be requited. The great imperial concubine called to mind the face of the old priest whom she had seen through her carriage window. It did not bear the remotest resemblance to the face of any of the men who had loved her until then. Strange it was that love should spring up in the heart of a man who did not have the slightest qualification for being loved. At this point, it will be clear to the listener that the great imperial concubine was not, as was so widely believed, the personification of courtly elegance, but rather a person who found the real relish of life in the knowledge of being loved. Despite her high rank, she was first of all a woman, and all the power and authority in the world seemed to her empty things if they were bereft of this knowledge. The men about her might devote themselves to struggles for political power, but she dreamt of subduing the world by different means, by purely feminine means. Many of the women whom she had known had taken the tonsure and retired from the world. Such women struck her as laughable. For whatever a woman may say about abandoning the world, it is almost impossible for her to give up the things that she possesses. Only men are really capable of giving up what they possess. That old priest by the lake had, at a certain stage in his life, given up the floating world and all its pleasures. In the eyes of the imperial concubine, he was far more of a man than all the nobles whom she knew at court. And just as he had once abandoned the present floating world, so now, on her behalf, he was about to give up the future world as well. The great priest of Shiga Temple was fighting. In the fight that he had waged against the flesh in his youth, he had always been buoyed up by the hope of inheriting the future world. But this desperate fight of his old age was linked with a sense of irreparable loss. The impossibility of consummating his love for the great imperial concubine was as clear to him as the sun in the sky. At the same time, he was fully aware of the impossibility of advancing towards the pure land so long as he remained in the thralls of this love. The great priest, who had lived in an incomparably free state of mind, had in a twinkling been enclosed in darkness, and the future was totally obscure. It may have been that the courage which had seen him through his youthful struggles had grown out of self-confidence and pride in the fact that he was voluntarily depriving himself of pleasure that could have been his for the asking. The great priest found a new pleasure in adorning his vision of the lady in various ways, just as though he were adorning a Buddhist statue with diadems and baldachins. In so doing, he turned the object of his love into an increasingly resplendent, distant, impossible being, and this afforded him particular joy. But why? Surely it would be more natural for him to envisage the great imperial concubine as an ordinary female, close at hand and possessing normal human frailties. Thus he could better turn her to advantage, at least in his imagination. As he pondered this question, the truth dawned on him. What he was depicting in the great imperial concubine was not a creature of flesh, nor was it a mere vision. Rather, it was a symbol of reality, a symbol of the essence of things. It was strange indeed to pursue that essence in the figure of a woman. Yet the reason was not far to seek. Even when falling in love, the great priest of Shiga had not discarded the habit to which he had trained himself during his long years of contemplation of striving to approach the essence of things by means of constant abstraction. The great imperial concubine of Kyogoku had now become uniform with his vision of the immense lotus of 250 yojana. As she reclined on the water, supported by all the lotus flowers, she had become vaster than Mount Sumeru, vaster than an entire realm. The more the great priest turned his love into something impossible, the more deeply was he betraying the Buddha. For the impossibility of this love had become bound up with the impossibility of attaining enlightenment. The more he thought of his love as hopeless, the firmer grew the fantasy that supported it, and the deeper rooted became his impure thoughts. So long as he regarded his love as being even remotely feasible, it was paradoxically possible for him to resign himself. But now that the great concubine had grown into a fabulous and utterly unattainable creature, the priest's love became motionless, like a great stagnant lake which firmly, obdurately covers the earth's surface. He hoped that somehow he might see the lady's face once more, yet he feared that when he met her, that figure, which had now become like a giant lotus, would crumble away without a trace. If that were to happen, he would, without doubt, be saved. Yet this time he was bound to attain enlightenment, and the very prospect filled the great priest with fear and awe. The priest's lonely love had begun to devise strange, self-deceiving guiles, and when at length he reached the decision to go and see the lady, he was under the delusion that he had almost recovered from the illness that was searing his body. The bemused priest even mistook the joy that accompanied his decision for relief at having finally escaped from the trammels of his love. None of the great concubine's people found anything especially strange in the sight of an old priest standing silently in the corner of the garden, leaning on a stick and gazing somberly at the residents. Ascetics and beggars frequently stood outside the great houses of the capital and waited for alms. One of the ladies in attendance mentioned the matter to her mistress. The great imperial concubine casually glanced through the blind that separated her from the garden. There, in the shadow of the fresh green foliage, stood a withered old priest with faded black robes and bowed head. And for some time the lady looked at him. When she realized that this was, without any question, the priest whom she had seen by the lake at Shiga, her pale face turned paler still. After a few moments of indecision, she gave orders that the priest's presence in her garden should be ignored. Her attendants bowed and withdrew. Now, for the first time, the lady fell prey to uneasiness. In her lifetime she had seen many people who had abandoned the world, but never before had she laid eyes on someone who had abandoned the future world. The sight was ominous and inexpressibly fearful. All the pleasure that her imagination had conjured up from the idea of the priest's love disappeared in a flash. Much as he might have surrendered the future world on her behalf, that world, she now realized, would never pass into her own hands. The great imperial concubine looked down at her elegant clothes and at her beautiful hands, and then she looked across the garden at the uncomely features of the old priest and at his shabby robes. There was a horrible fascination in the fact that a connection should exist between them. How different it all was from the splendid vision. The great priest seemed now like a person who had hobbled out of hell itself. Nothing remained of that man of virtuous presence who had trailed the brightness of the Pure Land behind him. The brilliance which had resided within him and which had called to mind the glory of the Pure Land had vanished utterly. Though this was certainly the man who had stood by the Shiga lake, it was at the same time a totally different person. When the priest had finally limped into the capital leaning on his stick, he had almost forgotten his exhaustion. Secretly, he made his way into the grounds of the great imperial concubine's residence at Kyogoku and looked across the garden. Behind those blinds, he thought, was sitting none other than the lady whom he loved. Now that his adoration had assumed an immaculate form, the future world once again began to exert its charm on the great priest. Never before had he envisaged the Pure Land in so immaculate, so poignant an aspect. His yearning for it became almost sensual. Nothing remained for him but the formality of meeting the great concubine, of declaring his love, and of thus ridding himself once and for all of the impure thoughts that tied him to this world and that still prevented him from attaining the Pure Land. That was all that remained to be done. It was painful for him to stand there, supporting his old body on his stick. The bright rays of the May sun poured through the leaves and beat down on his shaven head. Time after time he felt himself losing consciousness, and without his stick he would certainly have collapsed. If only the lady would realize the situation and invite him into her presence so that the formality might be done with. The great priest waited. He waited and supported his ever-growing weariness on his stick. At length the sun was covered with the evening clouds. Dusk gathered, yet still no word came from the great imperial concubine. She, of course, had no way of knowing that the priest was looking through her, beyond her, into the Pure Land. Time after time she glanced out through the blinds. He was standing there, immobile. The evening light thrust its way into the garden. Still he continued, standing there. The great imperial concubine became frightened. She felt that what she saw in the garden was an incarnation of that deep-rooted delusion of which she had read in the sutras. She was overcome by the fear of tumbling into hell. Now that she had led astray a priest of such high virtue, it was not the Pure Land to which she could look forward, but hell itself, whose terrors she and those about her knew in such detail. The supreme love of which she had dreamt had already been shattered. To be loved as she was, that in itself represented damnation. Whereas the great priest looked beyond her into the Pure Land, she now looked beyond the priest into the horrid realms of hell. Yet this haughty noblewoman of Kyogoku was too proud to succumb to her fears without a fight, and she now summoned forth all the resources of her inbred ruthlessness. The great priest, she told herself, was bound to collapse sooner or later. She looked through the blind, thinking that by now he must be lying on the ground. To her annoyance, the silent figure stood there motionless. Night fell, and in the moonlight the figure of the priest looked like a pile of chalk-white bones. The lady could not sleep for fear. She no longer looked through the blind, and she turned her back to the garden. Yet all the time she seemed to feel the piercing gaze of the great priest on her back. This, she knew, was no commonplace love. From fear of being loved, from fear of falling into hell, the great imperial concubine prayed more earnestly than ever for the Pure Land. It was for her own private Pure Land that she prayed, a Pure Land which she tried to preserve invulnerable within her heart. This was a different Pure Land from the priest's, and it had no connection with his love. She felt sure that if she were ever to mention it to him, it would instantly disintegrate. The priest remained standing in the garden. When the moon was hidden by the clouds, he looked like a strange, gnarled old tree. "That form out there has nothing to do with me," thought the lady, almost beside herself with anguish, and the words seemed to boom within her heart. Why in heaven's name should this have happened? At that moment, strangely, the great imperial concubine completely forgot about her own beauty. Or perhaps it would be more correct to say that she had made herself forget it. Finally, faint traces of white began to break through the dark sky, and the priest's figure emerged in the dawn twilight. He was still standing. The great imperial concubine had been defeated. She summoned a maid and told her to invite the priest to come in from the garden and to kneel outside her blind. The great priest was at the very boundary of oblivion when the flesh is on the verge of crumbling away. He no longer knew whether it was for the great imperial concubine that he was waiting or for the future world. Though he saw the figure of the maid approaching from the residence into the dusky garden, it did not occur to him that what he had been waiting for was finally at hand. The maid delivered her mistress's message. When she had finished, the priest uttered a dreadful, almost inhuman cry. The maid tried to lead him by the hand, but he pulled away and walked by himself towards the house with fantastically swift, firm steps. It was dark on the other side of the blind, and from outside it was impossible to see the lady's form. The priest knelt down, and covering his face with his hands, he wept. For a long time he stayed there without a word, and his body shook convulsively. Then in the dawn darkness, a white hand gently emerged from behind the lowered blind. The priest of the Shiga temple took it in his own hands and pressed it to his forehead and cheek. The great imperial concubine of Kyogoku felt a strange, cold hand touching her hand. At the same time, she was aware of a warm moisture. Her hand was being bedewed by someone else's tears. Yet when the pallid shafts of morning light began to reach her through the blind, the lady's fervent faith imbued her with a wonderful inspiration. She became convinced that the unknown hand which touched hers belonged to none other than the Buddha. Then the great vision sprang up anew in the lady's heart. The emerald earth of the Pure Land, the millions of seven-jeweled towers, the angels playing music, the golden ponds strewn with silver sand, the resplendent lotus, and the sweet voices of the Kalavinkas, all this was born afresh. If this was the Pure Land that she was to inherit, and so she now believed, why should she not accept the great priest's love? She waited for the man with the hands of Buddha to ask her to raise the blind that separated her from him. Presently he would ask her, and then she would remove the barrier, and her incomparably beautiful body would appear before him as it had on that day by the edge of the lake at Shiga. and she would invite him to come in. The great imperial concubine waited, but the priest of Shiga temple did not utter a word. He asked her for nothing. After a while his old hands relaxed their grip, and the lady's snow-white hand was left alone in the dawn light. The priest departed. The heart of the great imperial concubine turned cold. A few days later, a rumor reached the court that the great priest's spirit had achieved its final liberation in his cell at Shiga. At this news, the lady of Kyogoku set to copying the sutras in roll after roll of beautiful writing.